Hey everyone, Anders Sundquist here, host of the podcast Lean In, founder of Flawless Recruit, and a longtime recruiter myself. So I couldn't be more excited to talk with David Paffenholz, founder of Juicebox, and very deep in the AI landscape with TA Tech. So we're going to talk about his product today, how it works and fits in the AI recruiting landscape, and what that even means today. So if you're tuning in and you're curious about AI tools for recruiting, for sourcing, et cetera, you might want to take notes. I think we're going to talk about some interesting topics today. So without further ado, David, I'll let you introduce yourself. Give us a background on your career and then what led you to start Juicebox via YC.
For sure. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited for this. And yeah, I can kick off with that quick intro. So I'm David, co-founder of Juicebox. I'm originally from Germany, from a city called Dusseldorf, came to the US in 2018 and, hoping to stay here for the long term. I started Juicebox together with my co-founder 2 years ago. And actually, we initially took a bit of a different direction. And so we started off as a talent marketplace, really fun business to run, very operationally intensive, and really resulted in us spending a lot of time recruiting of onboarding talent into the marketplace. And so I'd say that was like the first, we basically went from not having done recruiting to spending like 80% of our time every single week doing recruiting for over a year. And we were really doing like the full cycle from sourcing through interviewing, onboarding, and then helping place that with talent. So operating a little bit like an agency as well. And so we ultimately decided to move away from that business because it wasn't as scalable as we thought it would be. But we started building out our own tooling during that. And that tooling is what ultimately developed into what Juicebox is today, which is the AI recruiting platform. And so that's how we got started. We launched the first version just over a year ago, came out of beta earlier this year. And since then, I've scaled up quite a bit, now working with over 500 customers.
Wow, awesome. Yeah, thanks for the background. And so, I want to touch on a little bit more about the Juicebox product and the story, the flavor of sourcing tool that it is. And so, if you're tuning in today, maybe you're new into sourcing, recruiting, maybe you're a talent or people leader, and you've heard of these legacy tools. I think the incumbent is, of course, LinkedIn, a traditional tool that's very good at what it does, but more on the manual side. Then when we look at tools that maybe are on the full, let's call it full automation or co-pilot, there's a lot of synonyms these days that claim to or can be trained or told how to fully autonomously source or recruit. Those tools, there's a few out there. Go look them up on your own if you're curious about what those might look and feel like. But there's some fear around tools that do these things. And some of those fears I hear from talent leaders are things like AI safety, lacking inclusion, and maybe things like hallucinations. And not that one is better or worse, but these are just things to consider. Then when we look along the spectrum of something maybe that more like sits in the middle, tell us where maybe Juicebox sits on that spectrum of manual, fully autonomous co-pilot, and explain the AI landscape in TA today for us.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a good question because I feel like there's so many buzzwords that float around like the space, and it's almost even like I'm in the space and sometimes I struggle to tell apart like what type of product is a platform. The way I think about it is kind of I call it like the Iron Man approach, where you give like superpowers to a person, or the full autonomy approach. And you can think of that as like, you might have seen like videos of like that Tesla robot that's like walking around or things like that, where there's no human in the Iron Man suit. And so we're the former. So we try to build superpowers for our recruiters. That means we help with sourcing. We do candidate reviews in the sourcing, so not inbound applicant review. We do outreach, and we help do a lot of the work, a lot of the repetitive pieces. And so we think that's where we can drive the biggest difference, because when building an autonomous system, it's extremely hard to get to, at least with the current AI available, to really replicating what a human is able to do. And the hardest part is ultimately that decision-making ability. And so being able to make some really key decisions and actually understand the role, go and ask follow-up questions, be able to really drive, hey, this is the candidate that we're looking for. And so I think the reason we've chosen this kind of giving superpowers approach or co-pilot approach is because we think that's the best way to drive the best hiring outcomes. And so we think we can make our users 10x faster, 10x more efficient than they would be otherwise, while still retaining them in the driver's seat and having them make the decisions on how the platform is used.
Very cool. Very cool. So coming into our call, I've done a fair amount of research, and I've played around with with Juicebox, and it was interesting to see. It was beyond interesting. It was clearly intentional in some of those filters that help those Iron Man recruiters wear that Iron Man suit. And um, I want the listeners today to, I don't want this to be like a demo, but I want them to hear and feel what are those differentiating filters that Juicebox has that they might experience when using a tool that sits in the middle of the AI spectrum in terms of a tool, and tell us how AI influences the tool beyond just manual filter attribution coordination.
For sure. So I'd say that AI impacts the platform, and I'm going to focus in on the search side because I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that's where
please.
a lot of the meat of the product is, and a lot of the focus is too. There's two ways that AI can influence search right now. The first is on the data collection side. So what type of data can be aggregated, and how can that be matched? And so that means, are we able to find the personal website for a given profile? Are we able to find a specific project that someone has worked on? Are we able to aggregate and index that information to be able to use it in our data set? That part is a lot more behind the scenes, but it's still really important because that's
Mhm.
the determines the quality of a match. Then the second part is the actual user-facing bit. And so how are we able to configure a search? What type of filters or criteria does the user want to use that we might not have or that might not exist? And what general purpose system can we build to support those filters? And
Mhm.
so those are some of the questions that we started thinking about when developing the first version of the platform. And kind of what that resulted in is we both have regular filters. So if you want to, do a Boolean on the job title or add in a power filter to focus on promotions, those are things that are clearly defined. There's no AI needed for that. But then there's another element of filtering or search, like having managed a team, say even a team of 5 people, having
Yeah.
led projects with a $20 million contract value. Those are things that are really hard to replicate in a Boolean or in like a manual filter, but where AI actually excels. And so it's able to read the full profile, consider the criteria, and then determine who's a match. And it's able to do that at scale of thousands of profiles simultaneously. Because it's able to do it at such large scale, to the user, it looks like a ranking or a search, when in reality, it's just reviewing every single profile. And so you can kind of think of that as a search or think of that as just a really time intensive process on the back end to help surface the best profiles.
Yeah, yeah, good answer. And I think, this is an interesting conversation, right? And those that know my story would know I started in the agency days at Aerotech. And if you didn't know, now you know. And so I've had this history of being, a sort of an agency recruiter. And then I founded recruiting companies and run recruiting companies in the embedded RPO and staffing space. And so I've managed and trained recruiters for years on how to effectively and internal teams too as a consultant on how to effectively source, screen, filter candidates in creative ways. And this has evolved over time. And it's interesting, you mentioned Boolean, and Boolean is I would say a good skill set to have, but oftentimes I've seen recruiters maybe lean on Boolean and not understand underlying fundamentals of profiles. And over time, as I was taught by some legends in the industry, different flavors of recruiting, I kind of arrived at this style that I like to teach and iterate on. And there's no one right way to source or recruit. If you're tuning in today, maybe saying, try this, try that. I'd be curious what works for you. So comment on the episode. But market mapping and talent mapping and using data to build TAMs and then create detailed aggregated lists of candidate attributes that your stakeholders are looking for, I've found to be one of the most efficient ways to source and recruit candidates. And when we first met in preparation for this call, you kind of gave me some background and context around how, recruiting teams, whether you're a talent leader, sourcing leader, or an individual contributor that are looking for a tool that can help them with market mapping and talent mapping, might be able to use Juicebox to do that effectively. I want you to unpack for us a little bit more about how Juicebox can help teams with market mapping and talent mapping. I think that's very important because, if you're an internal recruiter or an external agency recruiter consultant, you might be asked by a stakeholder to participate in being more of a talent advisor and providing data and a TAM and a short list for this market mapping project, as opposed to just say, who do you have? And a quick Boolean and calling some candidates and dumping them over and saying, are these folks a fit? That might not be as structured of an approach. So tell us, how can Juicebox help sourcers and recruiters build market maps and talent maps compared to legacy tools?
For sure. And I think that kind of plays nicely as well into like what the future of recruiting and sourcing might look like. And I think that kind of aspect that you mentioned of market mapping and talent mapping is exactly where more and more of it is going to go. And
Yeah.
so The way we think about searches, and you kind of touched on this too, is like there's kind of two approaches, right? One is like you first build out the market map or the talent map, and then you create a comprehensive picture of who could be there, and then you find the best fits from within that comprehensive list. And then the other approach is kind of the, spearfishing approach, where we see who is there and like who's the best person we can find, and they can be really good candidates, but we also aren't fully aware of who we might be missing out on. So we don't have that full understanding of who actually exists in the talent pool. And so right now, the majority of sourcing is still the latter. The majority of searching is people directly going into searches and just starting to configure them and starting to see what candidates we have. What we're trying to enable with Juicebox is that actually every single search has that talent mapping built into it. And so one way we do that is providing insights for every search. So we'll actually show you the data points. What is the distribution of job titles? What is the distribution of years of experience, top companies, former companies, and more? But we also then let you interact with that data. And so you can actually click into those data points, see the profiles behind those stats, rather than having it as like an abstract number. And that, I think, helps build that awareness of, this is actually what my talent pool looks like. These are the candidates we've covered so far. And here's how we could change the search if we need to, or if the candidates aren't going in the right direction. And that really helps provide that consultative approach. And I think that's where recruiting is shifting more and more towards, and what I think is also going to be shaping the future of the industry.
Yeah, I agree. And on recent episodes, we've actually touched on this. And the topic is kind of around how TA teams are evolving. And TA teams are evolving in many different ways, depending on the organization and the leadership philosophies. But one way is more of a talent architect, talent advisor that's more deeply aware of the data for talent pools, talent channels, and being able to coach and inform stakeholders around feasibility for different searches. And that includes things like different attributes of a profile, compensation, and certainly things around niche talent pools and even other filters that one might be searching for, an important topic being like DEI. And so, one of these things that's interesting is let's call it the data integrity or the compliance component when we're searching, and when I've talked with talent leaders in preparation for episodes or about upcoming episodes, that's one of the topics that I think, I don't want to say scares people, but I think people are aware of that AI might have an ability to hallucinate or might have a lacking with compliance and the different regulations in different countries and states for sourcing. Tell us a bit about AI safety today and how talent tools are impacted by AI safety. What kind of things should we be aware of when we're looking at AI tools? And then specifically, Juicebox, how does Juicebox play into that ecosystem of compliance, et cetera?
For sure. So I think there's really two things that end up driving the AI safety and compliance. Or if I were evaluating a tool, these are the two things that I would look at. The first one is perhaps more straightforward in the sense that it's more of a checklist. So what certifications, what audits, what compliance certificates does the company have, and do those match the expectations that we have as a company? There's some criticism of different like certifications, et cetera, but in the end, they provide a really good baseline, and they also help pass those internal security reviews much more quickly. Yeah. And then the second piece, and I think this is actually where it gets much more interesting, is asking some questions about what data does the model have access to at what point in time. Yeah. And so when we do our own internal audits or do our own internal testing, one of the things that we focus on the most is which specific data points could be influencing the model and which ones does it not have access to. And so as an example, we actually abstract away the far majority of like personal identifiable information, even just for fine-tuning different models that are used where it maybe wouldn't be necessary. And so, for example, we exclude things like names, we exclude things like locations, and then we add them back in the final step after the AI already has done its ranking and its assessment.
Oh, wow.
And so there's and that is actually an easier process than it sounds, but it's really powerful because the best way of knowing that we're like reducing a potential for bias is by removing the information that can cause that bias. Sure. And so that's been a big focus for us. And it's also like fairly straightforward to map that out and see what data points get used where. And then with regards to hallucination, that's an interesting one too. I think that there's some systems that companies can have in place to monitor the rate of hallucinating. Overall, though, I think we're benefiting a lot from the big improvements in foundational models. And so as new generations of OpenAI models, Anthropic models, and more come out, those hallucination rates fortunately also have a natural tendency to decrease drastically.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when I look at how sourcing tools are used, and I guess let's call it Juicebox, a sourcing tool, recruiting tool that empowers TA teams to be more efficient, like you said, 10x the output. It seems like the future, and we're going to touch on this in a few minutes, the future of TA teams. I want to foreshadow that, but using Juicebox feels different than if you haven't used an AI tool ever before. Maybe you've been using legacy tools like your internal database, or maybe traditional LinkedIn recruiter, where you're communicating with it through Boolean and filter attribution criteria. It feels very mechanical. And one of the things I noticed was it feels very conversational, like there's an assistant that I'm communicating with and I'm fine-tuning and fine-tuning. What I mean is when demoing the product coming into this call, it was like, okay, I'm looking for a software engineer in San Francisco that worked at a Series B fintech company with these attributes, maybe these technologies, or maybe a company that had this much ARR. It's the same way I would talk to a sourcing peer next to me or a hiring manager and be having a conversation calibrating on the attributes of a profile. And so what I found was it felt almost like a partnership, or like an assistant that was helping me search. But one of the things I noticed was if I didn't know, as let's call myself a talent architect or the advisor to the tool, what to search for, then the tool, the way I was using it, would not be able to find that candidate. And perhaps it could through the other search criteria like the JD search. But what I'm talking about is the query page. And so what I found was that it feels like sourcing and recruiting teams might be able to use tools like Juicebox to engage with the tool to more accurately find short lists of candidates, market maps, and different data sets. But there needs to be that architect who understands exactly what the criteria are, let's say, as opposed to someone who's looking again for, like, say, the keyword bingo, I used to call it, of Boolean, right? So how might AI TA tech tools change the future of TA teams? How might someone adopt Juicebox as a talent leader and reshape their team because of the impact that it has on the team's output?
It's a really interesting question. I think and it's one that we think about a lot. I think in the end, a lot of it, I kind of keep coming back to this analogy of like the way that executive search runs search processes
Yeah.
for an executive search role, which usually involves that comprehensive talent mapping aspect. So here's like every potential candidate that we could consider. And then once that pool of candidate exists, the actual search criteria usually get refined, because as we start looking at individual profiles, we notice additional elements that we actually want to filter for, or additional things that we want to consider in our search. And so the actual criteria that we're searching for get more narrow as we start searching.
Right.
And so the reason that I think that's important is because for every role, even the non-executive search roles, I think the process ends up becoming more and more similar. And so we look at, okay, with our given initial set of criteria, be that what we found out about in the calibration call, or like even if it's like a written list of initial criteria, let's say we have 10,000 profiles in that candidate pool. Now, are all 10,000 of those actually good fits? Usually the answer to that is no. And so why are they not good fits, or what elements about them makes them not good fits? And that's kind of where we get back into that process of refining a search. And so in the end, I think all search processes will have this comprehensive approach and then narrowing down. And then to tie that back into the actual structure of the team, or what that means for a TA team, one, I think it'll be more engaged with hiring managers than it is now, because it goes more directly into that consultative approach, and less time has to be spent on doing the legwork of kind of going in and researching individual profiles. And then two, I think it'll allow for putting even more emphasis on building relationship with that talent, even if it is not the talent that you're hiring right now. And so because you're doing this comprehensive mapping approach, you actually can see profiles or talent that you might not come across otherwise, and that you might not be hiring for right now, but that will be relevant in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months. And so kind of doing some of that research ahead of time, getting to know that talent ahead of time, I think is going to start becoming the norm, and actually a necessity for companies that want to attract or engage with the best talent.
Yeah, well said, well said. The R word really resonates with me, relationships. And I think if you're tuning in today and hearing about AI talent tools is scary, maybe, oh, I think it might replace my team or replace my role. I disagree. I think tools like Juicebox and others and the TA tool landscape is evolving to empower talent teams, whether you're an RC, a recruiter, a sourcer, anything under the people umbrella, to build more meaningful relationships and remove those manual tasks. That's how I experienced the tool coming into this call. And it was really cool to see being able to find more tightly calibrated candidates. And then I would be able to build more of a meaningful relationship versus filtering and sourcing. And when I was teaching sourcing and recruiting teams in the past, I used to call people out for analysis paralysis, where 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 75 minutes goes by and not one candidate had been messaged, called, or contacted because we were just looking at profiles. And it's kind of a joke, but it's true sometimes that can happen because of the manual nature of legacy sourcing tools. So I think my opinion, I think it sounds like resonates with yours, is that the future of TA teams will be focused on relationships, not just with candidates, but with stakeholders and clients. So very interesting. And so a curveball question for you is when you look at how Juicebox is built today and future maybe features that you're building, beyond sourcing and recruiting, how else might folks be able to use the tool?
Yeah. So I guess overall we are staying focused on the recruiting landscape. So we sometimes get like questions of, oh, can we use it for sales or similar? We do have some kind of agency customers who use it for a little bit of business development, but our core focus and like where we spend our time thinking about is how can we make sure we empower the best possible recruiting experience. And so what that means in kind of some of the additional features that we're working on or building out is really on that engagement side. And so I say, especially in the search side, we've gone pretty far already. There's still some work to do there too, but on the engagement side, I think there's a lot of kind of open space to build more. And so that can go from things like an assistant that is able to understand an email that a candidate wrote that they're not interested right now, but might be in 6 months, automatically add that into your calendar and send you a reminder in 6 months' time to check in with that candidate without you having to go in and configure anything. And so there's a lot of kind of easy things to pick up there that clearly make for a better candidate relationship, a better candidate experience, that go into that relationship management that are currently just have these little friction steps. And even if you have a CRM that has that reminder functionality and then you add it in, just going ahead and doing that is already a piece of friction that, sometimes just gets forgotten or gets like lost in the everyday workflow. And so I think there's a lot of things that we can do to take those administrative tasks away, make it a natural part of the process and kind of drive everything back to that candidate relationship. And so additional features in that direction can include things like helping draft responses to initial candidate questions, managing that candidate pipeline, or suggesting candidates to send additional check-ins with that are beyond a sequence that we maybe last reached out to 3 months ago or 4 months ago, really taking a longer term view of those candidate relationships as well.
Yeah, totally. I agree with all of those things. And one additional, almost a use case that resonated with me was, and it's kind of related to market mapping, but talent leaders that I talk to often before a search even kicks off, maybe before a new office is even opened, will ask me for help with talent intelligence and understanding a TAM within a geo, or a TAM within a country, or a TAM, a total addressable market, if you're tuning in and curious what TAM is. So talent intelligence kind of feeds into then the sourcing and recruiting projects. And, when I was looking at the map functionality, something we haven't talked too much about today, but there's a literal heat map under the insights feature, which I found very interesting. I in previous companies of mine have actually built pretty embryonic and rudimentary heat maps, but that show distribution of candidates across geos, and these talent intelligence reports, sometimes even an entire CSV of candidates, then we're able to inform talent leaders of where to even start hiring from. And so I think that this is another potential use case for sourcing and recruiting teams, or call it talent intelligence, to even before a project or a search kicks off, understand the data and the distribution, literally with the map, but then also with the underlying data sets of where candidates live. And so I think this all feeds into the concept of the future of talent teams will be more data centric, data focused, data inspired, and be able to have a more remove the administrative tasks to focus on those relationships so that there's less friction through the process. And that starts at the beginning with that research, that talent intelligence, then the market maps, talent maps, and then through the entire funnel. And so, definitely cool to see all those features and the intentionality that your team has put into Juicebox. And I'm curious. We're coming to the end of the year here. 2024 has been a blur, some whiplash for us in talent, I know, over the past few years. And I'm curious for you and your team, and specifically your opinion, if you had a crystal ball and you look 12 months from now and then 24 months from now, where will we be as a tech industry? Where will we be as a talent industry within tech? It feels like things are changing really rapidly. And I myself am always curious, how are things going to look a year or 2 years from now? But, as a co-founder of a TA talent tool, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I wish I could confidently say the answer. I think there's a couple of things that are happening right now that are interesting. The first one is kind of this wave of real AI adoption. And so I think we've had this big aha moment where the world saw ChatGPT. At this point, that's 2 years ago. That sounds kind of crazy to say, but it's been a while. And so what we're now starting to see is like applications really adopt it. And then I think the thing that is only really emerging now is that that's actually driving workflow efficiencies. And so it's, in a way, it's kind of surprising how long it's taken, like 2 years to really drive kind of everyday improvements and a lot of work from that generative AI revolution. And I think we'll start to see that play out more and more, both in like the tech industry overall, but also specifically within the talent function. And, that's part of what we're trying to do. But I think also other platforms in the space, like all the way from, ATS is really deeply integrating it into their systems through to dedicated talent intelligence tools, sourcing, and more. And so I think we're going to start seeing that impact or like really well implemented in tools that, where people maybe have tried to implement it so far, but it hasn't always given the outputs or like hasn't maybe lived up quite to the expectations that people had. And so I think that's my first prediction. And then I think my second one on a little bit more of a macro level, I think that also helps drive some kind of really conscious hiring growth in the industry. And so, maybe a little bit of wishful thinking there too, because obviously it benefits us in the industry too. But I think as companies start using that technology, they have to be extremely thoughtful about who they hire and who they bring on board too, which means more careful searches, more in-depth search processes, and a lot more focus on that quality of talent that's being brought into different organizations. And so those are my kind of macro predictions for the next year or two.
Yeah, no, thanks, David. I think no one has a real crystal ball. We all live in different corners of the sandbox, but it's interesting to hear perspective on how the market look, a year, 2 years from now. I feel fortunate to be able to have these conversations with co-founders like yourself and people and talent leaders across the industry. And one thing that I'm hearing is people leaders, HR leaders, and TAs typically sits under people. The people leaders have been given an envelope or a budget that is around 3 to 5%, say, of companies of revenue, right? And it used to be 4 to 6. So we're looking at this compression, this almost halving of a budget. And so it's no wonder that people teams, talent teams have been forced to make uncomfortable layoffs or maybe cut spending with entire organizations, say L&D or DEI within the organization, and then trickling down to tools. And often there's more scrutiny on those tools and do they work? Does this drive efficiency? And so I think as we look a year from now and 2 years from now, some of my personal crystal ball forecasts say, I think we'll see, given election uncertainty being past us, now we have at least a path forward. So we know what we're sort of dealing with. I think that I've seen personally, this is just my observation, is incremental increases in hiring already. I've seen, and there's data to support this, I don't know the exact numbers, but I posted about this recently, more TA leadership roles open and filled, and more recruiting roles open and then filled. And if someone has those exact stats, I'm going to be talking about that in some upcoming episodes, but please comment in the comments below. But just anecdotally, I'm seeing more recruiter leadership and recruiter roles being filled. What does this signal? This signals hiring next year. Those recruiters are going to have certain rec loads and be filling those roles. And I think we'll continue to see hiring increase responsibly, like you said. And then one of the other trends that I'm seeing is people and talent leaders are being asked by the C-suite or co-founders of tech companies to research and adopt AI tools to increase efficiencies. And when they say increase efficiencies, I think what they're saying is, being able to not just do more with less, but efficiency within the talent attraction, interview process, and then onboarding. And so this all brings us back to the R word of relationships. And I think that the tooling landscape, how I'm seeing it impact talent teams is in areas, say like interviews being recorded and summarized efficiently, scheduling being optimized, sourcing, filtering, screening candidates. And this empowers those TA teams to then have more meaningful relationships with internal stakeholders and those candidates. So my hope is a year from now and 2 years from now that we start to see things like the candidate experience, just the recruiting experience improve. I'm a little embarrassed to say that I think we took a few steps back in the last year or two from where we were in the 21s and 2022s. And the downturn saw some blemishes on those things. And so my crystal ball is that tools like Juicebox and others can help TA teams not just do more with less, but do more meaningful relationship building and help candidate experience improve and hopefully, rise the tides of the tech community as a whole. So that's my vision. That's my hope. What do you think?
I love that. Yeah, I fully agree. I think the only word of caution that I have, that, and you briefly touched on this, is the kind of company leadership asking different teams to adopt AI tooling, and that kind of being like
Yeah.
a strategic priority for the company. The and we have a lot of customers where that might be the case, or like different groups that are like looking at different tooling. And so my one word of caution there is always that the decisions, or like the real kind of motivation to bring on board new tooling, should always be driven by the team themselves, because
Yeah.
ultimately the impact can only be shown there. And I think there's a lot of like different types of flashy tools, and in all types of departments and industries, where maybe the actual ROI is not that strong, but it looks really good to leadership, or it looks really good internally. And so
Right.
that's always something where I challenge teams to really think about, is this actually making an impact on
Yeah.
my work, and does this really make me even better? Because in the end, that's the thing that matters. And it's like,
Yeah.
is our recruiting process truly getting better thanks to this? And so I think that's the big opportunity, and also the big risk is that kind of we're making sure we're making the right decisions on where we
Yeah.
grow and where we invest.
Yeah, I agree. I think that makes me think of the word adoption. And in other teams that I've managed, I've sometimes had, I would say, too many tools, and adoption was low sometimes for tooling. Maybe because the team was not seeing the results, or was stuck, or kind of had a pattern of behavior with a legacy tool. And so I think you're right, is having buy-in from the team, interest in adopting a new tool, whatever it is, and then some standardization around that adoption so that the ROI is there. And so if you're tuning in today as a people or talent leader or a sourcer, recruiter, or RC, have those conversations with your stakeholders, with your leadership, about where you might be able to see more efficiency, where there's maybe gaps. And if you're able to, as an organization, demo those tools. And so, after this call, there will be a demo link in the comments section. If you want to check out Juicebox, you can contact David directly as well. But I want to say thank you for joining the Lean In podcast, David. I've learned a lot since meeting you, so I'm grateful for our relationship we've been able to build. Very cool to see what you've built with Juicebox. So thanks for joining us, man.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
Bye, everyone.